Hi everyone, welcome back to the History Jacksonville show. I'm George Farrar and I have another great episode of History Jacksonville for you today, looking at presidential visits to Jacksonville over the years in the 20th century, focusing on visits from Presidents Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan, as well as Vice President Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey, both on their quests for the presidency with differing results over the years. Now, before we go into the 20th century of Jacksonville, let's take a look back at the 19th century briefly as we take a look on the Windsor Hotel. After the Civil War, tourism really developed in Jacksonville. Visitors from the north would come down on the railroad and they would visit at large hotels like the Windsor Hotel across from Hemming Park. At one point, Hemming Park was known as City Park. It wouldn't be known as Hemming Park until the late 1890s when the Confederate statue we see here was constructed. So this was an area for tourists to enjoy and also a place for the citizens of Jacksonville to gather. And this would have been is a postcard from 1903, and this was in October of 1906. Is this where this postcard essentially from a visitor to Jacksonville? And so to the right, you'll see the old Seminole Club, the Seminole Men's Club. It is now known today as Pete's Suites, and a unique place in Jacksonville's history because President Theodore Roosevelt visited Jacksonville in 1906. Teddy Roosevelt came to Jacksonville to promise the advancement of the project down in Panama, the Panama Canal Project. And he was well received by the people of Jacksonville. And so here we have an early 20th century picture of the old Seminole Club, now known as Pete's Suites. We see it before the enclosure of the second floor out on over the porch area. So this was from a long time ago. And so there's some very unique, when you take a look at where people would gather, very unique places in a sense. And here we have two pictures of the crowd that gathered to listen to President Roosevelt's speech. It says here, "The sunny South applauds President Roosevelt's assurance of a Panama Canal, Jacksonville, Florida." And so you get the chance to see the people of Jacksonville at that time. Notice all the hats, all the men wearing hats. There, if you look down to the bottom center, you'll see it looks like a police officer, an old style. I think that's a police officer there. And then further back, you see, everyone dressed to the nines back then. Okay, they were wearing suits. I think also too we have people from the military, possibly may have been active military, possibly people wearing veterans clothing. Okay, so uniforms, things like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and flash forward to the 1930s. We had the Great Depression, and in 1932, the people of the United States of America elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt to be president. But he wouldn't become president until March of 1933, because back then, presidents weren't sworn in until March the 4th of the year following the election. That wouldn't get changed until 1937. So we're going to have upcoming very interesting picture, and you'll get a chance to see Franklin Roosevelt visiting Jacksonville in 1933. Now, the unique thing about it is he visits Jacksonville initially as the president-elect in February 1933. And he's going to serve as president for 4 terms. And he's going to die in office in April 1945 after having led us through the Great Depression and, his biggest legacy, leading us through World War II. But all of that, really, World War II is years away. In this picture in 1933, in February 1933, he's in this car, okay? He's just across from Hemming Park. If you see, you can, in the distance, you can see the Confederate statue, the tip of the soldier on the Confederate statue. You can see the bandstand, and you can see further back, you see the trees. And then also, as we take a look, we see the man holding the microphone is John T. Alsop Jr. Okay, the Main Street Bridge is named after him. And he is a long-serving, one of the longest-serving mayors of Jacksonville. Okay, he was one of the longest-serving mayors of Jacksonville. He's holding a microphone, ostensibly, I guess, introducing the President-elect of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that we can see to our right in the car, and then just to Roosevelt's direct right is the governor of Florida at the time, David Schultz. So we can see that by the 1930s, Hemming Park and the area around it is a great place for the people of Jacksonville to welcome famous big visitors to the city. Incidentally, in this February 1933 trip, President-elect Roosevelt is going to go down to Miami. He's going to be in a car in Bayfront Park with the mayor of Chicago. The mayor of Chicago is going to be assassinated. He's going to die. The President-elect Roosevelt, he's going to survive. He's not going to be injured. And he's going to be sworn in on March 4th, 1933 as president. He then comes back to Jacksonville in 1934. It looks like he's having a lot of fun here. And take a look at the crowd. You can, a lot of people, again, we still have a lot of people wearing hats. Again, you have everyone's kind of gathered, dressed to visit, dressed for the visit. And so it's neat. You also get a chance to see some of the different cars of the time. Here we see President Franklin Roosevelt in his presidential limo, and he's on the naval base, the Naval Air Station. He's going to be visiting Jacksonville from time to time because the United States is gearing up and will be fighting World War II, and the buildup of the military to be able to accommodate this and to be able to successfully fight the war is going to be one of the biggest priorities of his administration. Now, let's flash forward now to 1960. Vice President Richard Nixon comes to town. He's later going to become president, but he isn't going to become president until January 20th, 1969. But he's running for president in 1960, and he'll run in 68. He's going to lose in 1960. But he does come to Jacksonville, and he speaks in Hemming Park. Across the way, we can see the J.C. Penney's and the Woolworths building. That's where the federal courthouse is today. Okay, so President John F. Kennedy is running for president also in 1960. And so in October 1960, he's also going to visit Hemming Park. And he's also going to speak to a crowd of citizens of Jacksonville in Hemming Park. And here, there's a great picture, one of my favorites of all time. John F. Kennedy in a convertible. To his right, lower right in the car, is Mayor Hayden Burns, a longtime mayor. He was mayor of Jacksonville from 1949 to around, I believe, 1965. Somewhere around there. And then to his left, to Senator, it would be Senator Kennedy's left, we have Lou Ritter, city commissioner. And so he's being escorted down the street. And in the distance, interesting, you see kind of an older house, and you see a phone booth. And then you also, looks like you see a servicing station, a car servicing station. You see a motorcycle cop behind him. And then taped to the limo, taped to the convertible, is Kennedy for president. Okay, he comes to Jacksonville, and he's running for president of the United States in 1960. 1960 is going to turn out to be one of the closest presidential elections in American history. And so everyone is coming, going around the country, and ultimately the two big candidates come to Jacksonville because every vote counts. And so it's interesting because we start to see we have seen in these pictures that practically in every picture with the politician, with the candidate, is the mayor of Jacksonville at the time. So that's kind of a neat thing. I will say, I unfortunately don't have a lot of pictures of the rally in October 1960 with Senator Kennedy running for president, but I do have text of his remarks at Hemming Park. And apparently Senator George Smathers, United States Senator, and the congressman at the time, Charlie Bennett, was there, along with Mayor Burns. Now, interestingly, Senator Kennedy talks about his older brother graduating from the Jacksonville Air Base in 1942, and he talked about his sea duty, where he took a torpedo boat from Rhode Island to the further down and actually stayed in Jacksonville. Okay, stayed in Jacksonville for a month. All right, here we have the vice presidential candidate, Senator Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, also called LBJ. And he's with his wife, Lady Bird Johnson. And of course, looks like Mayor Burns. And there is looks like a banquet. And we have the vice presidential candidate, Lyndon Johnson. And looks like he's looking off into space. Now look at in the background there. You see where it says Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon B. Johnson? Of course, remember, he's a vice presidential candidate, but he's running in the South, right? So he's running, and this is a kind of like they like to call the Boston-Austin connection, okay? Massachusetts, Texas. So they're trying to balance out the ticket, but ultimately, we of course know that Lyndon Johnson actually becomes president on November 22nd, 1963. And in 1964, he's going to come again to Jacksonville. He's going to come at least twice. He will come after Hurricane Dora impacts North Florida. He's going to come to Jacksonville to take a look at the damage. And here we see a map of Hurricane Dora. This was in September 1964. Here we see the Jacksonville Journal and the headlines blaring, Duval's loss put at 100 million. Here's a picture of President Lyndon Johnson after this hurricane, after this disaster, speaking in a room at Imison Airport, Thomas Imison Airport. That was the airport before what we know as JIA was constructed and opened in 1968. And again behind him, we see the mayor, Mayor Hayden Burns. Now, Hayden Burns will go on to become governor of Florida. And so now the Beatles also around this time come to town. They insist on a desegregated concert where whites and blacks can attend. And so they are going to perform at the Gator Bowl. And so you have this unique time in Jacksonville's history because you have all of this going on in the aftermath of the hurricane, which kind of goes to show, in a lot of ways, the city being able to really pull together and, at least for the teenagers of the time, especially the teenage girls of the time, to really enjoy the Beatles and really enjoy the music despite. And so now the Beatles also around this time come to town. They insist on a desegregated concert where whites and blacks can attend. And so they are going to perform at the Gator Bowl. And so you have this unique time in Jacksonville's history because you have all of this going on in the aftermath of the hurricane, which kind of goes to show, in a lot of ways, the city being able to really pull together and, at least for the teenagers of the time, especially the teenage girls of the time, to really enjoy the Beatles and really enjoy the music despite the devastation that was brought by Dora. In the 1960s, the times were changing. President Lyndon Johnson came back to Jacksonville and he campaigned in Hemming Park, and here he is addressing a crowd. And in the distance, you can see, it's interesting because you can see the cars back then. You can see that building in the distance is currently our City Hall. May Cohen's, you see the May Cohen's? That used to be a department store in the St. James building, now currently Jacksonville City Hall. Now here we see a fascinating picture, another one of my favorites. This one is on Hogan Street, and it's 1968. Lyndon Johnson has decided not to run for re-election, and the Democratic nominee for president in 1968 is Senator Hubert H. Humphrey. We see the Woolworths, we see the JCPenney's. Check out the Jones Brothers furniture. I can recall only just a couple years ago, around 2016, 2017, seeing the Jones Brothers furniture faded kind of in the distance. But check out the crowd that's gathered around him. And the interesting thing, though, is you see a lot of these crowds and things like that, but Jacksonville in the past has had an opportunity to be a place where presidents can go and meet with other leaders. In November 1975, a fascinating businessman named Raymond Mason, and he has a legendary story of his own that would probably be worthy of a History Jacksonville episode. He hosted at his mansion, the former DuPont estate, now we know as Epping Forest, he hosted a summit for President Gerald Ford and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. President Gerald Ford has a distinction of having not been elected president. He was vice president, assumed office, and he didn't happen to get elected. He's a great man. And the sad thing about it was that in 1981, Anwar Sadat would be assassinated in Egypt. So here you kind of have like a riverfront estate that enabled a very nice collegial visit to work towards Middle East peace. Now here we have actor and former governor of California, Ronald Reagan, in 1980, campaigning. He's again in Hemming Park. Here we see, it by this point was known as Hemming Plaza. And we see him in front of the JCPenney's building, Woolworth building. And here we see Reagan Bush for a new beginning. Okay? So he's going out, shaking hands with people. And he was a president who really had a very friendly, outgoing personality. And so it made his visits to Jacksonville. And I remember as a child, a couple speeches he gave in the city. When he came to town, it was a big thing. And when you're growing up, you're like, wow, the president's coming to town. And so, and it's interesting because take a look, you can see of the time, people kind of gathering, and this appears to be a press conference. Okay, so. All right, well, I do want to let you know that I really enjoyed putting together this episode of History Jacksonville, and I hope that you really enjoyed it too. Through May 2020, I've got some great shows planned for History Jacksonville. History Jacksonville, the History Jacksonville show will return in January 2020 to finish out the season with some great episodes, different shows. I'm really trying to bring you a lot. I hope you're enjoying it. Let me know what you think. Take it easy. See you later.